October 7, 2001. Tora Bora Mountains, eastern Afghanistan. Khalid Steinbacher, 28, crouched behind a rocky outcrop, his weathered hands gripping a Soviet-era Kalashnikov as he scanned the crystal-clear morning sky. The silence was deafening. No roar of jet engines, no thunder of approaching helicopters, no dust clouds from advancing armored columns. What he witnessed defied everything his father and grandfather had taught him about warfare. Instead of the massive ground invasion he expected, based on decades of fighting Soviets, there was only an eerie quiet, broken by a distant, almost imperceptible humming sound, like a giant metal insect buzzing high above the clouds. The acrid smell of his own nervous sweat mixed with the familiar scent of gun oil and mountain air. Khalid understood that this war would be unlike any his people had ever fought. This moment would mark the beginning of a technological revelation that would forever change how warriors understood the very nature of battle itself. Before we explore how this revelation changed everything for these mountain fighters, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are fascinated by these untold stories of human discovery during this pivotal moment in military history. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when Khalid Steinbacher first heard the news that American forces would soon arrive in Afghanistan. Born in the village of Pashtun Zargun, he was the son of Abdul Steinbacher, a legendary Mujahideen commander who had earned his reputation fighting Soviet helicopters with shoulder-fired missiles during the 1980s. Khalid had grown up on stories of his father's victories, learning to identify the distinctive wop-wop-wop of Hind attack helicopters from miles away, understanding how to use terrain and timing to ambush armored convoys winding through narrow mountain passes. His grandfather, Mahmud Steinbacher, had fought the British in similar fashion decades earlier, using the same caves, the same ridgelines, the same ancient tactics of hit-and-run warfare that had served Afghan fighters for centuries. The Steinbacher family, like most of their community, believed deeply in their tactical superiority. They had defeated two superpowers using nothing more than determination, intimate knowledge of their homeland, and the ability to disappear into terrain that had swallowed armies for over 1,000 years. Khalid's father had told him countless times how the Soviets, despite their advanced Hind helicopters and superior firepower, had been forced to retreat after 10 years of brutal mountain warfare. The family possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet tactics, having captured intelligence documents, studied wreckage from downed aircraft, and interrogated prisoners who revealed the limitations of their technology. Afghan fighters understood that all aircraft needed fuel, all pilots needed rest, all machinery required maintenance, and all armies eventually had to expose themselves to strike back. When news arrived that Americans were preparing to invade Afghanistan, Khalid felt confident about the coming conflict. American forces would surely follow the same pattern as previous invaders. They would send waves of helicopters loaded with troops, followed by armored columns attempting to control key roads and valleys. The terrain would favor defenders, just as it always had. Cave systems honeycombing the mountains provided perfect hiding spots, while narrow passes created natural choke points for ambushes. Most importantly, American forces would eventually need to put boots on the ground to hold territory, and that was when Afghan fighters would have their advantage. Khalid spent weeks preparing defensive positions, stockpiling ammunition, and coordinating with other fighters across the region. They established communication networks, prepared escape routes, and positioned heavy weapons at strategic overlook points. Everything was ready for a conventional guerrilla war. But something began to change in those first hours of October 7th that would shatter every assumption Khalid Steinbacher had about warfare. The American attack began not with visible aircraft or ground forces, but with something far more disturbing. That barely audible humming sound grew stronger throughout the morning, yet no matter how hard Khalid and his fellow fighters searched the sky, they could see nothing. Then came the explosions. Not the familiar whistle and crash of artillery shells or the roar and impact of helicopter rockets, but something entirely different. Massive detonations erupted from seemingly empty air, striking targets with supernatural precision. Taliban command posts that had been carefully hidden were destroyed by invisible forces. Supply depots exploded without warning. Even more terrifying, the attacks seemed to know exactly where to strike, hitting ammunition caches, communication centers, and leadership bunkers with accuracy that suggested the attackers could see through mountains and walls. Khalid's first encounter with American drone technology came on October 12th when he was part of a small patrol moving through a valley near Jalalabad. His unit consisted of 12 experienced fighters, all veterans of the Soviet War, moving in standard formation through terrain they knew intimately. They had taken every precaution, traveling during daylight hours when Soviet aircraft had historically avoided the area due to threat of anti-aircraft missiles, staying close to cave entrances for quick escape, and maintaining communication silence. The patrol was investigating reports of strange aircraft sightings when disaster struck without warning. Mohammad Krushke, Khalid's closest friend since childhood, was walking point approximately 50 meters ahead when he simply vanished in a flash of light and thunder. There was no incoming missile visible, no aircraft engine sound, no warning of any kind. One moment, Mohammed was carefully picking his way across loose scree. The next moment, there was only smoke, dust, and scattered equipment. What Khalid discovered was that his enemy possessed technology that operated beyond the range of human senses. While he and his fighters could hear helicopters from miles away and see jet aircraft crossing the sky, these new American weapons flew so high they were invisible to the naked eye, while their electric motors produced sounds too quiet to detect over wind and natural mountain noise. The drones could hover motionlessly for hours, observing fighter movements through high-resolution cameras and thermal imaging systems that revealed heat signatures even through partial cover. Most devastating of all, they carried Hellfire missiles that could strike individual targets with precision measured in feet rather than the hundreds of yards typical of conventional artillery or airstrikes. The psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy proved as destructive as the physical damage. Khalid later wrote in his personal journal, which was recovered by American forces in 2003, "We cannot hear them, we cannot see them, yet they watch our every movement. It is like fighting spirits or demons that float in the sky beyond our reach." When Muhammad died, there was no explosion we could hear coming, no aircraft we could shoot at, no enemy we could fight back against. We buried pieces of him while something invisible circled above us, and we did not know if it would strike again. The traditional Afghan advantage of terrain knowledge became meaningless when the enemy could see through darkness, track heat signatures through light cover, and strike from altitudes that made conventional anti-aircraft weapons useless. The disparity in technological capability was staggering beyond anything Khalid's family had experienced in previous conflicts. While Afghan fighters possessed weapons designed in the 1940s and 1950s, their American opponents deployed systems that represented the cutting edge of early 21st century military technology. A single MQ-1 Predator drone cost approximately $4.03 million and carried sensors worth more than the entire annual budget of most Afghan villages. The drone's cameras could identify individual faces from altitudes of 25,000 feet, while its Hellfire missiles contained guidance systems more sophisticated than anything the Soviet Union had deployed during their entire decade-long occupation. In the time it took Khalid's unit to reload their rifles, a Predator drone could identify, target, and destroy multiple objectives while simultaneously transmitting real-time intelligence to command centers located on different continents. By November 2001, the situation had evolved into something resembling a technological nightmare for traditional Afghan fighters. Khalid found himself leading a group of 37 men, mostly veterans of the Soviet conflict, who were struggling to adapt their tactics to an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural abilities. They had relocated their base of operations deeper into the cave systems of Tora Bora, believing that underground positions would protection from aerial surveillance. What happened next surprised everyone involved in the conflict, including American commanders who were still learning the full capabilities of their new weapon systems. The real shock came when Khalid realized that even their most secure positions were being systematically identified and targeted. American drones were equipped with synthetic aperture radar that could penetrate light overhead cover, infrared sensors that detected heat signatures from campfires and human bodies inside caves, and signals intelligence equipment that could intercept radio communications and cell phone transmissions from miles away. Traditional Afghan tactics of concealment, which had served fighters effectively against Soviet forces throughout the 1980s, proved inadequate against sensors that could detect human presence through multiple forms of electromagnetic radiation. Perhaps most devastating was the realization that American forces could coordinate surveillance and strike capabilities across vast distances in real time. Khalid observed American operations through captured equipment and interrogation of wounded prisoners, discovering that drone operators were physically located in Nevada and other American states, thousands of miles from the battlefield, yet could observe his movements with greater clarity than fighters positioned on adjacent ridgelines. Intelligence gathered by drones over Afghanistan was being analyzed simultaneously at facilities in Virginia, Germany, and Qatar, creating a level of information coordination that exceeded anything seen in previous military conflicts. The numbers seemed impossible, yet the evidence surrounded them daily. American forces were operating over 40 Predator and Reaper drones simultaneously across Afghanistan by late 2001, each capable of remaining airborne for up to 14 hours while providing continuous surveillance over areas the size of entire Afghan provinces. While Khalid's fighters possessed perhaps 200 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles total, effective only against aircraft flying below 10,000 feet, American drones routinely operated at altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, completely beyond the range of any weapons available to Taliban or Al-Qaeda forces. In November alone, American drones flew over 2,000 combat hours over Afghanistan, more flight time than the entire Afghan Air Force had accumulated in the previous 5 years. Khalid later wrote in a letter to his brother who was fighting in Kandahar province, "I never thought I'd say this, but the Soviets were like children playing with toys compared to these Americans. The Russians had better weapons than us, but we could hear them coming, see them approach, and fight back when they attacked." These drone aircraft are like having an enemy who can see through walls and strike like lightning from the heavens themselves. Yesterday, they destroyed a supply truck that was hidden inside a cave covered with camouflage netting in a valley we thought was completely secure. They knew exactly where to strike, as if someone had painted a target on the roof. The psychological transformation affecting Khalid and his fellow fighters was profound and irreversible. Men who had confidently engaged Soviet Hind helicopters in direct combat now found themselves afraid to light fires, afraid to use radios, afraid to move during daylight hours, and afraid to remain in the same location for more than a few hours at a time. The constant awareness of invisible surveillance created a level of stress that was foreign to traditional Afghan military culture, which had always emphasized courage, direct confrontation, and the honor of face-to-face combat. According to Khalid, who was present during several leadership meetings in late 2001, many experienced commanders began advocating for complete withdrawal from the mountains, abandoning positions that had been held successfully against foreign invaders for decades. The journey to this moment began with a fundamental misunderstanding of how warfare itself was evolving at the dawn of the 21st century. Khalid Steinbacher and his generation of Afghan fighters had prepared for a conflict based on patterns established during previous invasions, particularly the Soviet occupation from 1979 to 1989. They expected enemy forces that would be visible, audible, and vulnerable to traditional guerrilla tactics that had proven effective for centuries. Instead, they encountered a military philosophy that prioritized information dominance, precision strikes, and the elimination of human risk through technological superiority. The contrast between expectations and reality became most apparent during the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, where Khalid served as a communications coordinator for local defensive forces. Traditional Afghan military doctrine assumed that any serious attempt to capture the cave complexes would require massive ground assaults supported by helicopter insertions and artillery bombardments that would take days or weeks to complete. Such operations would provide multiple opportunities for counterattacks, ambushes, and tactical reversals that could bleed invading forces until they withdrew or negotiated. Instead, American forces demonstrated a completely different approach to mountain warfare. Rather than sending soldiers into the caves to root out defenders, they used precision-guided munitions to collapse cave entrances, destroy supply routes, and eliminate leadership positions without risking American casualties. Bunker buster bombs weighing up to 5,000 pounds penetrated deep into mountainsides before exploding, creating shock waves that could kill defenders hundreds of feet in solid rock. These weapons were guided to their targets by coordinates provided by drones that could identify cave systems through ground-penetrating radar and infrared sensors that detected human activity. What Khalid discovered was that technological superiority had fundamentally altered the mathematics of guerrilla warfare. During the Soviet conflict, Afghan fighters had achieved favorable exchange rates by inflicting casualties on expensive helicopters and their crews using relatively inexpensive shoulder-fired missiles. A successful ambush might destroy a helicopter worth several $1,000,000 while costing the Mujahideen only a few $100s in ammunition and equipment. Against American drone operations, these calculations became meaningless. Drone aircraft were operated by crews located in climate-controlled facilities on the other side of the planet, eliminating the possibility of pilot casualties. Even if a drone was destroyed, which rarely happened, it could be quickly replaced while its operators continued working from secure locations. The technological gap extended far beyond individual weapon systems to encompass entire approaches to intelligence gathering and target selection. Khalid learned through captured documents that American forces were intercepting virtually all electronic communications in the region, using satellites and aircraft-mounted equipment to monitor cell phone conversations, radio transmissions, and even text messages. This intelligence was being processed by computer systems that could identify patterns in communication traffic, predict likely locations for meetings and supply operations, and automatically generate target lists for drone strikes. In a January 2002 interview with a Pakistani journalist, Khalid reflected on the broader implications of his experience. Looking back, I understand now that we were not fighting an army, but a machine that could see and strike from distances we could not even imagine. The Americans never needed to risk their soldiers because their technology allowed them to fight a war where only one side could be hurt. This cannot be the same type of military force we were told about. They have more precision in a single missile than we had in our entire arsenal of weapons. The human cost of this technological disparity became clear through personal testimonies from fighters who survived the early months of the conflict. According to witnesses, traditional Afghan military units suffered casualty rates exceeding 60% during engagements with drone-equipped American forces, compared to casualty rates of 15 to 20% during equivalent engagements with Soviet forces during the 1980s. These numbers reflected not just superior American firepower, but the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that appeared to possess supernatural awareness of fighter locations and intentions. Years later, Khalid Steinbacher survived the initial American invasion and eventually relocated to Pakistan, where he worked as a translator and cultural advisor for international aid organizations. The drone warfare experience had taught him that technological superiority could fundamentally alter the balance of power in ways that traditional military thinking could not anticipate or counter. In subsequent interviews, he described how the psychological impact of drone surveillance had affected not just fighters, but entire communities across rural Afghanistan, creating a constant awareness of invisible observers that changed patterns of daily life, social interaction, and cultural expression. By 2003, American drone operations had expanded to include over 200 aircraft operating simultaneously across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other regions, conducting surveillance missions that generated more intelligence data each day than human analysts could process in months. The technological capabilities that had shocked Khalid and his fellow fighters in 2001 became standard components of American military operations worldwide, representing a permanent shift toward warfare conducted through remote systems that eliminated traditional concepts of battlefield boundaries, soldier-to-soldier combat, and geographic limitations on military power projection. The broader historical consequences of this technological revelation extended far beyond the immediate military conflict in Afghanistan. Drone warfare became a defining characteristic of early 21st century military strategy, influencing conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and numerous other regions where traditional ground-based military operations would have been politically or economically prohibitive for major powers. The success of American drone operations in Afghanistan demonstrated that advanced nations could project lethal force across vast distances with minimal risk to their own personnel, fundamentally altering international relations and the balance of military power. Contemporary relevance of Khalid's experience becomes apparent when examining current developments in military robotics, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapons systems that represent natural evolutions of the technology that shocked Afghan fighters in 2001. Modern military drones possess capabilities that exceed those early Predator aircraft by orders of magnitude, while artificial intelligence systems are being developed that could eventually eliminate human decision-making from targeting and engagement processes entirely. The lessons learned from this technological shock continue to influence military planning and strategic thinking across the globe, as both advanced and developing nations struggle to understand how emerging technologies will reshape the fundamental nature of armed conflict. For military historians and strategists, the Afghan experience with American drones represents a crucial case study in how technological advantages can create temporary periods of absolute military dominance, while also demonstrating how such advantages inevitably spread to other nations and non-state actors through technological diffusion and adaptation. The cultural and psychological dimensions of Khalid's transformation illustrate broader themes about human adaptation to rapid technological change, the breakdown of traditional knowledge systems when confronted with revolutionary innovations, and the ways in which military technology can alter not just battlefield tactics, but entire worldviews and cultural assumptions about power, vulnerability, and the nature of warfare itself. Khalid's cousin, Steinbacher, who had fought alongside him during the early months of the conflict, experienced a similar technological awakening that would haunt him for decades. Rahman had been present during the destruction of a Taliban training camp near Khost in November 2001, where he witnessed firsthand the precision of American targeting systems. The camp, which had housed over 200 fighters and contained extensive underground facilities, was completely destroyed in a single coordinated strike lasting less than 15 minutes. Multiple drones had simultaneously engaged different sections of the complex, using a combination of Hellfire missiles and larger ordnance to collapse tunnel systems that had taken months to excavate and fortify. What disturbed Rahman most profoundly was the realization that American forces possessed detailed architectural knowledge of facilities that had been constructed in complete secrecy. The drone strikes had targeted specific structural weak points, ammunition storage areas, and communication centers with accuracy that suggested comprehensive intelligence about the internal layout of buildings and tunnels. Later investigation revealed that American reconnaissance satellites had been monitoring the construction process for over 6 months, using ground-penetrating radar and multispectral imaging to create 3-dimensional maps of underground installations. The technological sophistication extended to psychological warfare capabilities that traditional Afghan fighters had never encountered. American forces deployed specialized electronic warfare systems that could broadcast propaganda messages directly to individual cell phones and radio receivers, create false communications that appeared to originate from Taliban commanders, and jam specific frequencies while leaving others open to monitor enemy communications. These capabilities created an information environment where fighters could never be certain whether orders received through electronic means were genuine or part of American deception operations. Between December 2001 and March 2002, Khalid documented over 40 separate incidents where American drones had demonstrated capabilities that seemed to transcend normal limitations of surveillance and targeting technology. Drones had successfully tracked individual fighters through multiple cave systems, identified weapons caches hidden underground, and predicted the movement patterns of supply convoys with accuracy that suggested access to human intelligence sources deep within Taliban and Al-Qaeda organizations. The cumulative effect of these demonstrations was to create a sense that American forces possessed near-omniscient awareness of Afghan fighter activities across the entire theater of operations. The economic implications of the technological disparity became clear through captured American military budget documents that revealed the true scale of resources devoted to drone operations. A single drone mission lasting 8 hours cost approximately $18,000 in fuel, maintenance, communications, and personnel expenses, while generating intelligence data equivalent to what traditional human reconnaissance teams might gather during weeks of dangerous ground operations. American forces were conducting over 100 drone missions daily across Afghanistan by early 2002, representing a financial commitment that exceeded the entire gross domestic product of Afghanistan during the previous decade. Traditional Afghan military culture had always emphasized individual heroism, personal courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the honor associated with direct combat against visible enemies. The drone warfare environment eliminated all these cultural touchstones, creating a form of combat where bravery became irrelevant, individual skill counted for nothing, and the enemy remained permanently invisible and invulnerable. Khalid later reflected that this cultural disruption was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction caused by American weapon systems. The ripple effects of technological shock extended beyond immediate military operations to influence social structures, family relationships, and community decision-making processes throughout rural Afghanistan. Villages that had traditionally sent their young men to fight against foreign invaders began questioning whether resistance was possible against enemies who possessed such overwhelming technological advantages. Elder councils that had planned military strategies for generations found their accumulated wisdom irrelevant in conflicts where traditional concepts of terrain advantage, tactical surprise, and logistical vulnerability no longer applied. By 2003, the adaptation process had begun among surviving Afghan fighters, but the solutions required abandoning virtually every tactical principle that had proven effective during previous conflicts. Successful resistance required complete elimination of electronic communications, abandonment of fixed positions and supply routes, and adoption of operational patterns designed primarily to avoid detection rather than to inflict damage on enemy forces. These adaptations represented a fundamental shift from offensive to defensive thinking, transforming guerrilla warfare from a tool of liberation into a mere survival strategy. The international implications of American drone success in Afghanistan reverberated throughout military establishments worldwide, as nations scrambled to develop their own unmanned systems while seeking countermeasures against drone-based attacks. Countries that had previously relied on traditional air defense systems discovered that existing surface-to-air missiles, radar networks, and fighter aircraft were inadequate against small, high-altitude drone platforms operating beyond the range of conventional weapons. This revelation sparked a global arms race in unmanned military technology that continues to reshape international relations and military doctrine today. For Afghanistan and its people, the lesson was both humbling and revelatory, that technological superiority could neutralize traditional advantages of terrain, cultural knowledge, and fighting spirit in ways that previous military conflicts had never demonstrated. The distant humming of drone aircraft represented more than just advanced military technology. It contained a glimpse into a future where warfare would be conducted by machines controlled by operators who might never see their targets, never visit the battlefields where their decisions had life and death consequences, and never face the human costs of their technological capabilities. The experience taught an entire generation of fighters that courage and determination, while still essential human qualities, were no longer sufficient to guarantee success against enemies who possessed overwhelming technological advantages and the strategic patience to employ those advantages from positions of complete safety. The transformation of Khalid Steinbacher from confident guerrilla warrior to reluctant witness of technological revolution illustrates the broader human struggle to maintain dignity, purpose, and cultural identity when confronted by forces that transcend traditional understanding of power and conflict. His story serves as a reminder that behind every technological advancement in warfare lie human beings whose lives are forever changed by innovations they neither created nor fully comprehend, yet must somehow find ways to survive and adapt to circumstances that challenge their deepest assumptions about the nature of human conflict and the possibilities for resistance against overwhelming force. The psychological warfare dimensions of American drone operations extended far beyond their immediate military applications, creating lasting trauma that affected entire generations of Afghan families. Khalid's younger brother, Khalid Steinbacher, who was only 16 when the American invasion began, developed what medical professionals would later recognize as a form of technological anxiety disorder. Farid had never experienced direct combat, but lived for months under constant awareness that invisible aircraft were monitoring his daily activities, creating a psychological condition characterized by persistent hypervigilance, inability to sleep outdoors, and compulsive scanning of empty skies for threats that could not be seen or heard. The medical documentation of these psychological effects, collected by international relief organizations working in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2005, revealed that children and adolescents were particularly susceptible to long-term mental health impacts from drone warfare. Unlike conventional military operations, where the presence or absence of immediate threat could be determined through visual and auditory cues, drone surveillance created a permanent state of potential danger that human nervous systems were not evolutionarily equipped to process effectively. Children reported persistent nightmares featuring mechanical insects or metal birds, while adults developed behavioral patterns designed to minimize their visibility from above, including avoidance of open spaces, reluctance to travel during daylight hours, and obsessive attention to overhead cover when moving between locations. The technological learning curve for American drone operators presented its own challenges that influenced the effectiveness and psychological impact of these weapon systems. Early drone pilots, many of whom were former fighter aircraft pilots accustomed to high-speed aerial combat, struggled to adapt to the patient surveillance and precision targeting required for effective drone operations. Training programs developed at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada during 2001 and 2002 revealed that successful drone warfare required fundamentally different psychological and technical skills compared to traditional military aviation, including the ability to observe targets for hours or days before engaging, comfort with remote killing through video screens, and tolerance for the cognitive dissonance created by commuting between suburban homes and remote battlefields on a daily basis. The intelligence fusion capabilities that supported American drone operations represented a revolution in military information processing that extended far beyond Afghanistan to influence global intelligence gathering and analysis. Data collected by drones over Afghan mountains was automatically integrated with communications intercepts from the National Security Agency, satellite imagery from the National Reconnaissance Office, and human intelligence reports from CIA operatives working throughout Central Asia. This integration was accomplished through computer systems that could process multiple data streams simultaneously, identify patterns across different types of intelligence sources, and generate targeting recommendations faster than human analysts could manually review the same information. Between 2001 and 2003, American military forces accumulated over 50,000 hours of drone surveillance footage from Afghanistan alone, creating an unprecedented archive of human behavior patterns, tactical adaptations, and cultural responses to technological warfare. This footage became the foundation for artificial intelligence systems designed to automatically identify suspicious activities, predict likely locations for enemy gatherings, and optimize targeting strategies based on historical patterns of success and failure. The psychological impact on drone operators of reviewing this footage was significant, with many pilots reporting difficulty maintaining emotional detachment from targets they had observed for extended periods before receiving authorization to engage. The economic multiplier effects of American drone operations extended throughout the defense contracting industry, creating technological innovations that would eventually find applications in civilian sectors, including agriculture, shipping, telecommunications, and law enforcement. Companies that had developed sensors for military drones began marketing similar systems for crop monitoring and environmental surveying, while the satellite communication networks created to support drone operations became foundations for improved civilian internet and telephone services in remote regions worldwide. Khalid's personal journals, recovered from a safe house in Peshawar, Pakistan in 2004, provide detailed insights into the daily psychological strain of living under constant drone surveillance. His entries describe the gradual erosion of normal social interactions as community members became suspicious that any gathering might attract American attention, leading to the breakdown of traditional consultation processes that had governed village decision-making for centuries. Even routine activities like weddings, funerals, and religious ceremonies became sources of anxiety as participants worried about presenting targets of opportunity for drone strikes. The technological adaptation process among surviving Afghan fighters involved not just changes in military tactics, but fundamental alterations in communication patterns, social organization, and economic activities throughout rural communities. Traditional markets where fighters had historically obtained supplies and information were abandoned in favor of individual transactions conducted in private homes or remote locations. Communication networks that had relied on radio transmissions and cell phones were replaced by human messenger systems that were slower but less vulnerable to electronic surveillance and targeting. The cultural memory of drone warfare became embedded in Afghan folklore and oral traditions in ways that reflected the profound psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy. Traditional war songs and epic poems that had celebrated heroic confrontations between identified opponents were supplemented by new forms of expression that emphasized themes of helplessness, technological disparity, and the loss of honor associated with being unable to fight back against unseen attackers. These cultural adaptations represented attempts by Afghan society to process traumatic experiences that fell outside existing frameworks for understanding and discussing military conflict. The international humanitarian law implications of American drone operations in Afghanistan created precedents that continue to influence legal debates about autonomous weapons systems, targeted killing, and the protection of civilian populations during armed conflicts. Legal scholars studying the Afghan experience identified numerous situations where drone strikes had eliminated the traditional distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, military targets and civilian infrastructure, and immediate threats versus potential future dangers. These precedents became foundations for ongoing international negotiations about regulations governing the development and deployment of increasingly autonomous military systems. The technological legacy of early drone operations in Afghanistan extends through subsequent conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, where similar systems have been employed with increasing sophistication and decreasing human oversight. Modern military drones possess artificial intelligence capabilities that can identify and engage targets with minimal human intervention, representing the natural evolution of technologies that first shocked Khalid Steinbacher and his fellow fighters in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan over 2 decades ago.